The weathered hands stopped mid-prayer, trembling as they hovered over the German shepherd's graying muzzle. Bobby Mitchell's finger found the cold metal trigger, his breath catching in the suffocating heat of the rusted Arizona bus that had become their tomb. Atlas wasn't just dying. He was drowning from the inside, his kidneys shutting down hour by hour. The medication bottles crashed to the floor as Bobby's hand shook violently, each plastic cylinder echoing like gunshots in the cramped space. His daughter's words from yesterday's phone call rang mercilessly. "Dad, it's just a dog." Just a dog. The only soul on earth who'd stayed when everyone else walked away, who'd pulled him back from the edge of madness more times than he could count. The same loyal companion who'd slept beside his bed through 3 years of nightmares, who'd never flinched when Bobby screamed himself awake. "I'm sorry, boy," Bobby whispered, his voice cracking like dry desert earth. "I can't watch you suffer anymore." But what Bobby didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that beneath their feet, Atlas had already found the answer. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Robert "Bobby" Mitchell had been a different man. At 64, he'd carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd served his country with honor in Vietnam, who'd built a decent life with calloused hands and an honest heart. The small ranch house outside Phoenix had been filled with 40 years of memories. His late wife Margaret's quilts still draped over the couch, faded photographs of family barbecues lining the hallway, and always, always, the gentle padding of Atlas's paws across the hardwood floors. Margaret's cancer had taken everything. Not just her laugh that used to fill their kitchen each morning, or the way she'd hum while tending her desert roses, but every dollar they'd saved, every dream they'd planned for their golden years. The medical bills had been relentless, a paper avalanche that buried them deeper each month. Even after she'd slipped away in that sterile hospital bed, her fingers still intertwined with his, the debt collectors hadn't stopped calling. Atlas had been Margaret's final gift, in a way. She'd found him as a 6-week-old puppy, abandoned behind the VA hospital where Bobby received his PTSD treatments. "He needs us," she'd whispered, cradling the trembling ball of black and tan fur. "And maybe we need him, too." She'd been right, as she always was. When the nightmares came, the helicopter sounds, the screams of wounded soldiers, the smell of jungle rot, Atlas seemed to sense them before Bobby did, pressing his warm body against his master's chest until the trembling stopped. Now the German shepherd was 8 years old, his muzzle touched with silver, his intelligent brown eyes still alert despite the illness slowly claiming him. The veterinarian's words from this morning echoed in Bobby's mind. End-stage kidney failure. Without dialysis or a transplant, maybe 10 days. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. $12,000. That's what it would cost to give Atlas a chance." Bobby had exactly $247 in his checking account. Their home now was a 1978 school bus, rust bleeding through its faded yellow paint like old wounds. Bobby had bought it for $800 from a junkyard, towed it to this forgotten patch of desert 20 miles from anywhere. It sat like a beached whale among the creosote bushes and Palo Verde trees, its broken windows patched with cardboard, its interior stripped to bare metal ribs. His daughter Sarah lived in Scottsdale with her husband and 2 kids, working double shifts as a nurse. She called once a week, her voice tight with worry and barely concealed frustration. "Dad, there are programs, assisted living facilities. You don't have to live like this." His son Tommy had made partner at his law firm in Denver. He called less frequently, their conversations stilted and formal. Both children had inherited their mother's compassion, but they couldn't understand why their father had chosen isolation over accepting their help, why he'd rather live in a metal box than move closer to family. They didn't understand that Atlas wasn't just a pet, he was the thread holding Bobby's sanity together. The morning sun was already brutal at 7 a.m., turning the metal bus into an oven. Bobby had spent the night on the floor beside Atlas, listening to his labored breathing, counting each rise and fall of the dog's chest like a prayer. When Atlas hadn't touched his food for the third straight day, Bobby knew they were out of time. The drive to Desert Paws Veterinary Hospital took 45 minutes. Atlas lying motionless in the passenger seat of Bobby's battered pickup truck. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a kind woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, had been treating Atlas for 2 years. She'd always been straight with Bobby, never sugarcoating the harsh realities of veterinary medicine for someone on a fixed income. His kidney function has dropped to 12%, Dr. Hernandez said, her stethoscope still around her neck as she studied the blood work results. Without immediate intervention, he'll go into complete renal failure within the week. Bobby's weathered hands gripped the examination table. What are his options? Dialysis to buy time, but that's expensive and only temporary. The real solution would be a kidney transplant. She paused, watching Bobby's face carefully. I won't lie to you, Mr. Mitchell. We're looking at $12,000 minimum, possibly more if there are complications. The number hit Bobby like a physical blow. 12,000 might as well have been 12 million. He thought of the $247 in his account. The result of selling every possession that wasn't nailed down, Margaret's jewelry, his tools, even his Bronze Star medal. How long? Bobby's voice was barely above a whisper. 10 days, maybe less. I'm sorry. Dr. Hernandez's hand briefly touched Bobby's shoulder. There is another option. We could make him comfortable, manage his pain until— No! The word came out sharper than Bobby intended. Not yet. The drive back to the bus passed in a blur of desert landscape and grinding gears. Bobby carried Atlas inside, the dog's weight seeming heavier than before, and settled him on the makeshift bed they shared. As he reached for his phone with trembling fingers, he dreaded the conversation he was about to have. Sarah answered on the second ring. Dad? Is everything okay? Atlas is dying. The words felt like broken glass in his throat. Kidney failure. The vet says he needs a transplant. A long silence stretched across the phone line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Dad, I'm sorry. I really am. But maybe it's time to consider that Atlas has had a good life. 8 years is $12,000. Bobby cut her off. That's what it cost to save him. Another pause. Bobby could hear the sounds of his grandchildren playing in the background, the normal chaos of a family morning routine that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Dad, I can help with some of it. Maybe $2,000. But my kids need that college fund, and with Mike's hours being cut. Sarah's voice cracked. I'm sorry, but I can't justify spending that kind of money on a dog when you won't even accept help to get yourself into decent housing. The words stung, but Bobby understood. Sarah was practical like her mother had been. She saw the bigger picture while Bobby was drowning in the details of today. Tommy's reaction was even worse. Jesus, Dad, it's a dog. You're living in a bus in the middle of nowhere, refusing to take care of yourself, and you want us to fund some fantasy medical procedure for a pet? He's not a pet, Bobby said quietly. He's family. Family? Tommy's voice rose. We're your family. Sarah and I are your family. And you've been pushing us away for months while you play house with a dog in that death trap you call home. The argument that followed was brutal. Tommy accused Bobby of choosing Atlas over his human relationships. Bobby tried to explain what the dog meant to him, how Atlas had been his anchor through the worst of the PTSD, how he'd saved Bobby from the gun more times than his children would ever know. "You need professional help, Dad," Tommy said, finally. "And if you won't get it voluntarily, maybe Sarah and I need to look into other options." The line went dead. Bobby sat in the suffocating heat of the bus, staring at his phone. Outside, a roadrunner darted between the cacti, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The desert was full of survivors, creatures that had learned to endure in impossible conditions. Atlas stirred on the bed, lifting his head with tremendous effort to look at Bobby. Those brown eyes, clouded with pain but still full of trust, held no judgment, no conditions, just love. "All right, boy," Bobby whispered, his decision crystallizing like desert minerals in the heat. "If they won't help us, we'll figure it out ourselves." The next morning, Atlas did something he hadn't done in 3 days. He stood up. Bobby woke to the sound of the dog's claws scraping against the metal floor of the bus, a determined scratching that cut through the desert silence like a prayer being answered. Atlas was at the far end of the bus, near where Bobby had ripped out the old bench seats, his nose pressed against a section of flooring that looked identical to every other rusted panel. "What is it, boy?" Bobby pushed himself up from the thin mattress, his joints protesting the movement. Atlas looked back at him with those intelligent eyes, then returned to his scratching, more insistent now. Bobby had learned long ago to trust Atlas's instincts. In the worst days after Margaret's death, when the nightmares came so frequently that Bobby barely slept, Atlas had always known. The dog would position himself between Bobby and whatever invisible enemy his master was fighting, a warm barrier against the darkness that lived in Bobby's mind. Kneeling beside the German shepherd, Bobby ran his hands over the corrugated metal. The section Atlas was focused on felt different, not loose exactly, but not as solidly attached as the surrounding panels. Using a screwdriver from his meager toolbox, Bobby pried at the edges. The panel came away with a grinding screech of metal on metal, revealing a hollow space beneath. And there, wrapped in an oil-stained canvas tarp, was a military footlocker. Bobby's breath caught in his throat. The footlocker was olive drab, standard Army issue, with stenciled numbers that were too faded to read clearly. But it was the dog tags hanging from the handle that made his hands shake as he lifted the box from its hiding place. The name on the tags read, S.P.C. Marcus Thompson. Bobby sank back on his heels, the footlocker balanced across his knees. Marcus Thompson. The name hit him like a desert flash flood, sudden and overwhelming. He hadn't thought about Marcus in years, had buried those memories as deep as he could manage, but holding the dog tags brought it all back in vivid, painful detail. Vietnam, the jungle. The kid from Ohio who'd been in Bobby's squad for exactly 43 days before the mortar round that changed everything. With trembling fingers, Bobby opened the footlocker. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic bags, were photographs, letters, and official documents. There were pictures of a young Marcus Thompson with his family, a stern-faced father, a mother with kind eyes, and a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The letters were addressed to "My dearest son" in a woman's flowing script. But it was the manila envelope at the bottom that made Bobby's heart race. Inside were military records, but not just any records. These were documents that had been classified, papers that detailed the circumstances of Marcus Thompson's death and the actions of his squad mates in the aftermath. Bobby's own name appeared multiple times in the reports, along with accounts of how he'd carried the wounded soldier through 2 miles of hostile territory, how he'd stayed with Marcus until the medic arrived, how he'd held the boy's hand as he died far from home. There was more. A life insurance policy that had never been claimed, bank account numbers, and at the very bottom a sealed letter addressed simply to "Whoever finds this." Bobby's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Marcus's death, written in the careful handwriting of someone who sensed his time was running short. If someone is reading this, it means I didn't make it home, the letter began. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I need you to know that the man who tried to save me, Sergeant Bobby Mitchell, is a hero. The Army reports won't tell the whole story. They never do. But Bobby Mitchell carried me when I couldn't walk, stayed with me when others would have moved on, and tried to give me the chance to see my little boy again. I'm leaving everything I have to Bobby Mitchell and to the dog I hope he'll find someday. There's a German Shepherd puppy at the animal shelter in Saigon, the one the medics have been feeding scraps to. His mother was killed by shrapnel, same as mine will be soon. Take care of him, Bobby. Call him Atlas. He'll carry the weight of the world for you, just like you carried it for me. The insurance money, the bank account, all of it goes to Bobby and Atlas. Tell my father I forgive him for the things he said before I shipped out. Tell my little boy, Marcus Jr., that his daddy died thinking about him. Bobby's vision blurred as he read the final lines. Sometimes the family you choose matters more than the family you're born into. Bobby Mitchell chose to be my brother when it mattered most. Atlas will choose to be his family when Bobby needs it most. Take care of each other. The letter was signed with a shaky signature and dated 3 days before the mortar attack that killed Marcus Thompson. Bobby looked at Atlas, who had settled beside him with his head resting on Bobby's thigh. The connection he'd always felt with the dog suddenly made perfect sense. Atlas wasn't just a companion. He was a promise kept, a bond that stretched across decades and continents. But there was something else in the footlocker that made Bobby's blood run cold. Mixed in with Marcus Thompson's personal effects were more recent documents, insurance claims, medical records, and correspondence from the Department of Veterans Affairs. All of them bore Bobby's name, and all of them had been systematically denied or delayed. The signature at the bottom of each denial letter was the same: Marcus Webb, Claims Adjuster, Southwestern Regional Office. Bobby's mind raced. Marcus Webb had been the faceless bureaucrat who'd been jerking Bobby around for months, denying his disability claims, delaying his widow's benefits, making every interaction with the VA system a nightmare of red tape and rejection. But seeing the name next to Marcus Thompson's effects couldn't be a coincidence. As Bobby dug deeper into the papers, the truth became clear. Marcus Webb wasn't just any claims adjuster. The birth certificate tucked between the other documents confirmed it. Marcus Webb Jr., born to Marcus Thompson and Susan Webb Thompson, 3 months before his father deployed to Vietnam. Bobby was staring at evidence that Marcus Thompson's son had grown up, joined the VA system, and was systematically denying benefits to the very man his father had wanted to help. Atlas lifted his head and looked directly at Bobby, those brown eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. The dog had led him to this discovery for a reason. In his weakened state, Atlas had used what might be his last reserves of strength to show Bobby something that could change everything. The insurance policy alone was worth $50,000, enough to save Atlas 10 times over. But more than that, it was proof of a connection that went deeper than Bobby had ever imagined. A bond between soldiers that death hadn't severed, and a promise that a dying man's son had spent decades trying to break. Bobby carefully repacked the footlocker, his mind already working through the implications. Tomorrow, he would drive to the VA office in Phoenix. He would walk into Marcus Webb's office and lay the truth on his desk. But tonight, he would sit with Atlas and read every letter in that footlocker, honoring the memory of a young soldier who died believing in the power of chosen family. Bobby spent the night reading every document in Marcus Thompson's footlocker by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Atlas lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to watch Bobby's face as emotions flickered across it: recognition, anger, grief, and something that might have been hope. The insurance policy was legitimate, the bank account numbers real, and the legal documents all properly notarized. Marcus Thompson had left Bobby a lifeline from beyond the grave. But first, Bobby had a reckoning to face. The VA regional office in Phoenix was a concrete monument to bureaucratic indifference. squatting in the desert heat like a fortress designed to keep people out rather than help them. Bobby had been here dozens of times over the past year, each visit leaving him more frustrated and defeated than the last. Today felt different. Today, he carried Marcus Thompson's truth in a manila envelope clutched against his chest. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, recognized Bobby immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have an appointment with Mr. Webb today?" "No appointment," Bobby said quietly, "but he'll want to see me." 20 minutes later, Bobby was sitting across from Marcus Webb, Jr., in a sterile office filled with filing cabinets and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Webb was younger than Bobby had imagined, maybe 45, with his father's strong jaw but none of the warmth Bobby remembered from the photographs. His desk was stacked with claim folders, each one representing a veteran whose benefits hung in bureaucratic limbo. "Mr. Mitchell," Webb said without looking up from his computer screen, "I've reviewed your file again, and I'm afraid our position hasn't changed. Your PTSD claim lacks sufficient medical documentation, and your widow's benefits claim has inconsistencies that require further review." Bobby placed the manila envelope on the desk between them. "I think you'll want to look at this first." Webb glanced at the envelope with irritation. "Mr. Mitchell, if this is more documentation for claims we've already processed, open it." Something in Bobby's tone made Webb look up. For the first time in their bureaucratic relationship, Webb actually saw Bobby. Not just another file number, but a man whose eyes held depths of pain and knowledge that couldn't be dismissed with form letters. Webb opened the envelope and pulled out the birth certificate. His face went white as he read his own name, his father's name, his mother's maiden name. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the photograph of Marcus Thompson in his Army uniform. "Where did you get these?" Webb's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father left them for me," Bobby said, "along with a letter explaining how I was supposed to take care of you and your mother after he died. How I was supposed to make sure his insurance money helped his family." Bobby leaned forward. "Tell me, Marcus Jr., how's your mother doing these days?" The color drained completely from Webb's face. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." His voice cracked on the word. "She spent her whole life waiting for someone to tell her the truth about what happened to my father." Bobby pulled out Marcus Thompson's letter and placed it on the desk. "He wrote this 3 days before he died. Read it." Webb's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. Bobby watched emotions play across the younger man's face. Confusion, recognition, grief, and finally, a crushing weight of understanding. When Webb finished reading, tears were streaming down his cheeks. "He wanted to take care of us," Webb whispered. "All these years I thought his squad abandoned him. Mom told me stories about how soldiers left their wounded behind, how they chose their own lives over their brothers." "Your mother was angry," Bobby said gently. "Grief makes people look for someone to blame. But your father died in my arms, son. I carried him 2 miles through hostile territory. I never left him." Webb looked up at Bobby with his father's eyes, now filled with a pain that went deeper than bureaucratic indifference. "Then why didn't you find us? Why didn't you make sure Mom got the insurance money?" Bobby pulled out the VA denial letters, each one bearing Webb's signature. "Because someone's been making sure I never got the benefits I needed to track down your family. Someone's been systematically denying every claim I've filed for the past year." The realization hit Webb like a physical blow. He stared at his own signature on the denial letters, understanding flooding his face. "Oh God. Oh my God. What have I done?" "You were protecting your mother's pain," Bobby said. "I understand that. But your father wanted something different for his family." Webb buried his face in his hands. "She died believing you abandoned him. She died hating a man who tried to save her husband's life." His shoulders shook with sobs. and I've been continuing her hatred, punishing you for something you never did." The office fell silent except for the sound of Webb's quiet crying and the distant hum of the air conditioning system working against the Phoenix heat. Bobby felt no satisfaction in the younger man's breakdown, only a deep sadness for the years of misunderstanding and misdirected anger. "There's more," Bobby said eventually. "Your father mentioned a dog, a German Shepherd puppy he wanted me to find." Webb looked up, his eyes red with tears. "You found him?" "His name is Atlas. He's been my companion for 8 years. Bobby's voice grew thick. "He's dying, Marcus. Kidney failure. I came here today because I need that insurance money to save him." Something shifted in Webb's expression. "The dog my father mentioned in the letter, he's still alive?" "Barely. The vet says he has days, maybe a week without treatment." Bobby pulled out the medical reports from Dr. Hernandez. $12,000 for a kidney transplant. It's the only chance he has. Webb stared at the medical records, then back at his father's letter. "My father wanted you to take care of that dog. He said Atlas would carry the weight of the world for you." "He has," Bobby said simply. "Every day for 8 years. When the nightmares came, when I couldn't get out of bed, when I thought about eating my gun, Atlas was there. He's been the bridge between me and the world when I couldn't find my way back from the war." Webb stood up abruptly and walked to his filing cabinet. He pulled out Bobby's thick file folder and set it on his desk. "Every claim in here, they're all legitimate, aren't they? Every one. The disability rating, the widow's benefits, the medical coverage. I've been denying them all because I thought you were the enemy." Webb's voice was hollow. "How much money are we talking about?" Bobby shrugged. "I never cared about the money. I just wanted someone to acknowledge that what happened over there mattered, that the men who died mattered." Webb began pulling papers from Bobby's file, studying each one with new eyes. Retroactive disability payments, widow's benefits for your late wife, medical coverage for your PTSD treatment. He looked up at Bobby. "This is over $60,000 in back benefits you should have received." "I don't need $60,000, Bobby said. "I need $12,000 to save my dog." "You need both," Webb said firmly. He was typing rapidly on his computer now, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I can approve emergency medical coverage immediately. And the transplant surgery will be fully covered under your VA benefits, which should have been active months ago." Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "You can do that?" "I can do more than that." Webb's voice was growing stronger, more determined. "I can make sure every veteran in this office gets a fair review. I can make sure my father's sacrifice means something." He looked at Bobby directly. "I can try to make up for what I've done to you." "Making up for it would be saving Atlas," Bobby said. "Everything else is just paperwork." Webb printed out a stack of forms and began signing them rapidly. "Consider it done. I'll call Dr. Hernandez personally and authorize immediate treatment." He paused in his signing. "There's something else. My father's life insurance policy. It names you as the beneficiary. That's another $50,000 that rightfully belongs to you." Bobby shook his head. "That money was meant for his family." "For you." "I am family," Webb said quietly. "But so are you. My father made that clear in his letter." He finished signing the forms and handed them to Bobby. "Use the money however you think he would have wanted, but start by saving that dog." Bobby took the papers with hands that were no longer trembling. The official stamps and signatures looked like hieroglyphs of hope, symbols of a bureaucratic miracle he'd never dared to imagine. "There's one more thing," Webb said. "I want to meet Atlas. I want to see the dog my father thought was important enough to mention in his final letter." Bobby nodded. "He's back at the bus. He's weak, but he'd like to meet Marcus Thompson's son." Webb gathered his things and locked his office. "I'm driving out there with you." This can't wait. He paused at the door. And Mr. Mitchell? Bobby? I'm sorry, doesn't begin to cover what I owe you, but it's where I have to start. The drive back to the desert was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. Webb followed Bobby's pickup truck and his government sedan, the air conditioning fighting against the afternoon heat. When they reached the bus, Atlas was lying in the shade underneath the vehicle, panting heavily. Bobby knelt beside the dog and gently coaxed him out. Atlas, I want you to meet someone. This is Marcus Jr. His father was a friend of mine. Atlas looked at Webb with those intelligent brown eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the simple acknowledgement of shared loss. Webb knelt in the desert dust, not caring about his clean government clothes. "Hello, Atlas," Webb said softly. "My father wrote about you. He said you'd take care of Bobby when he couldn't anymore." The German shepherd lifted his head and placed it gently in Webb's outstretched hand. Webb's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears, not the bitter tears of anger and regret, but something cleaner and more healing. "We're going to get you fixed up, buddy," Webb said. "My dad would have wanted that." Bobby pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Hernandez's number. When she answered, he could barely contain the relief in his voice. "Doc, it's Bobby Mitchell. I need to schedule that surgery for Atlas. The VA is covering it." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Bobby thought the call had dropped. Finally, Dr. Hernandez spoke. "Bobby, are you serious? Full coverage?" "Emergency authorization. The paperwork's already approved." "Bring him in immediately," she said. "I'll prep the surgical suite. We're going to save your dog, Bobby." As they loaded Atlas into Bobby's truck for the ride to the veterinary hospital, Webb put his hand on Bobby's shoulder. "There's going to be a lot more paperwork to sort through. Back benefits, medical coverage, all the things I should have approved months ago." "Later," Bobby said. "Right now, we save Atlas." Webb nodded. "Right now, we save Atlas. Everything else can wait." The sun was setting over the desert as they drove toward Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the truck bed, carefully wrapped in an old army blanket, Marcus Thompson's footlocker rode along, a bridge between the past and the future, between guilt and forgiveness, between a father's love and a son's redemption. Atlas lifted his head and looked out the window, watching the desert landscape roll by. For the first time in days, his tail moved slightly. Not quite a wag, but something close to hope. Dr. Hernandez was waiting in the parking lot when Bobby's truck pulled up to Desert Paws Veterinary Hospital. She had her surgical scrubs on, and 2 veterinary technicians flanked her, a gurney already positioned and ready. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as Bobby carefully lifted Atlas from the passenger seat. "How's he been during the drive?" Dr. Hernandez asked, her hands immediately moving to check Atlas's pulse and breathing. "Weak, but alert," Bobby replied. "He lifted his head a few times, like he knows something's happening." Marcus Webb, Jr. climbed out of his sedan, still wearing his government suit, but now dusty from kneeling in the desert. Dr. Hernandez looked at him with curiosity, not recognizing the man who'd been instrumental in delaying Bobby's care for months. "This is Marcus Webb," Bobby said simply. "He's the one who made sure the VA approved the surgery." "Doctor?" Hernandez's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd heard Bobby curse Marcus Webb's name more than once during previous visits, but she focused on the task at hand. "We need to get Atlas inside immediately. I've contacted a specialist in Tucson who can perform the transplant, but first we need to stabilize him and run more comprehensive tests." They transferred Atlas to the gurney with gentle efficiency. The German shepherd's breathing was labored, but his eyes remained fixed on Bobby's face as they wheeled him through the automatic doors. The familiar antiseptic smell of the veterinary hospital hit Bobby like a wall of memory. He'd been here too many times in recent months, watching Atlas's condition deteriorate with each visit. "The surgery itself will take 6 to 8 hours," Dr. Hernandez explained as they moved through the hallway. "Dr. Sarah Yazzie from Tucson is driving down tonight. She's one of only 3 veterinarians in Arizona qualified to perform kidney transplants on dogs. We're incredibly lucky she's available." Marcus Webb walked alongside them, his face pale but determined. "Whatever the cost, whatever you need, it's covered. No questions, no delays." Dr. Hernandez shot Bobby a look that clearly said, "What happened to change this man's mind?" But Bobby just nodded. "Long story, Doc. The important thing is Atlas gets the help he needs." They reached the preoperative area, where Atlas would spend the night being stabilized before surgery. Bobby knelt beside the examination table, his weathered hand stroking the dog's graying muzzle. Atlas's tail gave the faintest wag, barely more than a tremor, but it was enough to break Bobby's heart. "Listen to me, boy," Bobby whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You fight tomorrow, you hear me. You fight like the warrior you are, and I'll be right here waiting for you." Atlas tried to lift his head, managing only to press his wet nose against Bobby's palm. The simple gesture carried 8 years of unconditional love, loyalty that had never wavered even when Bobby had been at his worst, in the depths of PTSD episodes that left him curled in a corner for hours. Dr. Hernandez touched Bobby's shoulder gently. "We need to start his IV fluids and get him settled for the night. Why don't you go home and get some rest? Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Bobby started to protest, but Marcus Webb stepped forward. "Actually, Dr. Hernandez, would it be possible for Mr. Mitchell to stay? I know it's unusual, but given the circumstances—" "I can arrange for a cot in the family room," she said after a moment's consideration. "Many pet owners stay for major surgeries. Just try to get some sleep, Bobby. Atlas is going to need you strong tomorrow." As the veterinary team began their preparations, Bobby and Marcus found themselves in the small family waiting room. The walls were decorated with photos of successful surgeries and happy reunions between pets and their owners. Marcus sat heavily in one of the plastic chairs, still processing the events of the day. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said quietly. "About my mother, about what she went through after my father died." Bobby settled into the chair across from him, exhausted but willing to listen. "She got one letter from the Army," Marcus continued. "Official notification that he'd been killed in action. No details, no explanation of what happened or who he was with. For 40 years, she imagined the worst, that he died alone, that his squad abandoned him, that his sacrifice meant nothing to anyone." Bobby closed his eyes, remembering his own family's struggles with his military service. Margaret had lived with his nightmares, his sudden rages, his inability to explain where his mind went during the dark periods. "She used to have these episodes," Marcus went on. "She'd get angry at random soldiers she'd see in uniform, accuse them of being cowards who came home while her husband didn't. The anger ate her alive, Bobby. It consumed our whole family." "Anger's easier than grief sometimes," Bobby said quietly. "Your mother needed someone to blame, and I was the logical target." "But you weren't to blame." Marcus's voice cracked. "You tried to save him. You carried him through hell, and instead of being thanked for it, you've been punished by his own son for the past year." The weight of generational trauma hung heavy in the room. Both men had been shaped by Marcus Thompson Sr.'s death in ways they were only beginning to understand. The father's sacrifice had created ripples that had taken decades to reach shore. "There's something else," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "I called my supervisor after we left the VA office. I told him everything, about the denied claims, about who you really are, about what my father wanted." He looked at Bobby directly. "I'm probably going to lose my job." Bobby frowned. "That wasn't my intention." "It should be my intention," Marcus interrupted. I've been systematically denying legitimate claims to veterans, Bobby. Not just yours, dozens of them. My anger at a ghost was hurting real people who deserved better. He paused. My supervisor is launching an investigation. Every claim I've handled in the past 2 years is going to be reviewed. The implications were staggering. How many veterans had been denied care because of Marcus Webb's misdirected grief? How many families had suffered because one angry son couldn't let go of his father's death? What will you do? Bobby asked. Marcus shrugged. Face the consequences. Maybe this is how I honor my father's memory, by making sure his sacrifice wasn't used as an excuse to hurt people he would have wanted to help. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Dr. Hernandez peeked in, her expression cautiously optimistic. Atlas is stable, she reported. His kidney function is worse than we thought, but Dr. Yazzie arrived early and she's confident about the surgery. We've also had some good news. A compatible donor has been found. Bobby's heart leaped. A donor? A young German Shepherd mix at the county shelter. He's healthy, the right size, and his owners surrendered him because they couldn't afford treatment for a minor condition that we can easily fix. If the transplant is successful, both dogs will have a chance at a full life. The synchronicity felt like something Margaret would have called divine intervention. A dog in need, a dog who could give life, 2 companions who would save each other. When? Bobby asked. 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Dr. Yazzie wants to start early to give both dogs the best chance. Dr. Hernandez hesitated. Bobby, I have to ask, are you sure about this? The surgery is expensive, complex, and there are no guarantees. Bobby thought of Marcus Thompson's letter, of the insurance money that had been waiting 40 years to serve its purpose, of Atlas's unwavering loyalty through 8 years of Bobby's worst moments. I'm sure, he said firmly. Dr. Hernandez nodded. Then we'll see you at dawn. After she left, Marcus and Bobby sat in comfortable silence for a while. The hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm. The soft beeping of monitors, the distant sound of staff moving through the corridors, the occasional bark from the boarding area where healthier animals waited for morning procedures. I want to contribute to Atlas's care, Marcus said eventually. Not through the VA, but personally. My father's insurance money, the $50,000, I want you to use whatever you need for Atlas and set up the rest as a fund for other veteran service animals. Bobby looked at the younger man with new respect. Your father would be proud of that decision. Maybe, Marcus said. I hope so. I've got 40 years of anger to make up for. As the night wore on, Bobby dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, waking every time a staff member walked past or a machine beeped. Marcus had found blankets for both of them, and sometime around midnight he'd fallen asleep still clutching his father's photograph. At 3 a.m., Bobby was awakened by a gentle touch on his shoulder. A veterinary technician, a young woman with kind eyes, was standing beside his chair. Mr. Mitchell, Atlas is asking for you. Bobby followed her through the dimly lit corridors to the recovery area. Atlas was lying on a padded table, IV lines running into his front legs, but his eyes were alert and focused on the doorway, as if he'd been waiting for Bobby to appear. He's been restless, the technician explained. Dr. Hernandez thought seeing you might help him relax before surgery. Bobby approached the table slowly, his heart breaking at the sight of Atlas hooked up to so many machines. The German Shepherd's tail gave a weak wag when he saw Bobby, and he tried to lift his head. Hey there, warrior, Bobby whispered, his hand finding the familiar spot behind Atlas's ears. Just a few more hours, boy. Just hang on a few more hours. Atlas settled at the sound of Bobby's voice, his breathing becoming more regular. Bobby stayed with him for 20 minutes, talking quietly about the desert morning they'd have together when this was all over, about the walks they'd take when Atlas was strong again, about the good life that was waiting on the other side of dawn. When Bobby returned to the waiting room, Marcus was awake, staring at the photograph of his father. "How is he?" Marcus asked. "Scared, but fighting," Bobby replied, like his namesake, carrying the weight of the world. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My father chose that name well." Outside the hospital windows, the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. In 2 hours, Dr. Yazzie would begin the most important surgery of Atlas's life. Bobby settled back into his chair, Marcus's quiet presence a comfort he hadn't expected. For the first time in months, Bobby allowed himself to hope. The surgery began at dawn, just as Dr. Yazzie had promised. Bobby watched through the observation window as the surgical team prepared both dogs. Atlas on one table, the young donor, German Shepherd mix named Scout, on another. The precision of the medical choreography was mesmerizing, each team member moving with practiced efficiency under the bright surgical lights. Dr. Yazzie was a small woman with steady hands and an intensity that reminded Bobby of the best medics he'd known in Vietnam. She'd spent an hour before surgery explaining the procedure, the risks, the long recovery ahead if everything went well. The odds were better than Bobby had dared hope. 70% chance of success for both dogs. "The donor kidney is healthy and a good size match," she'd told Bobby. "Scout here is young, strong, and will live a completely normal life with one kidney. Atlas will need immunosuppressive medications for the rest of his life, but if his body accepts the transplant, he could have several more good years ahead of him." Several more years. Bobby had thought he'd lost Atlas already, had been preparing to say goodbye. Now he was being offered a gift he'd never expected. Time. Marcus Webb sat beside Bobby in the observation area, both men silent as they watched the surgery unfold. 3 hours in, everything was proceeding smoothly. Dr. Yazzie had successfully removed Scout's kidney and was now preparing to transplant it into Atlas. The German Shepherd's vital signs remained stable, his strong heart continuing to beat steadily despite his kidney's failure. Then, at hour 4, something went wrong. The monitor that had been beeping steadily suddenly began racing, the rhythm erratic and alarming. Bobby pressed his face against the observation window, watching as the surgical team's calm efficiency transformed into urgent activity. "What's happening?" Bobby asked Dr. Hernandez, who had been monitoring the surgery from the observation room. "His blood pressure is dropping," she said, her own voice tight with concern. "It could be a reaction to the anesthesia, or his body might be rejecting the new kidney." Bobby's hands pressed against the glass as he watched Dr. Yazzie work over Atlas's still form. The surgeon's movements were quick and precise, her team responding to her commands with practiced urgency. Bobby could see her lips moving, calling out instructions he couldn't hear through the observation window. The minutes stretched like hours. The erratic beeping continued, punctuated by the flat, terrifying sound of a heart monitor flatlining. Bobby's own heart seemed to stop beating as he watched the surgical team work to revive the dog who had been his anchor for 8 years. "Come on, Atlas," Bobby whispered against the glass. "Fight, boy. Fight!" Marcus Webb's hand found Bobby's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. Both men knew they were watching more than a veterinary surgery. They were watching the culmination of promises made by dead soldiers, the resolution of 40 years of misdirected grief, the test of whether love could triumph over the random cruelties of biology. Dr. Yazzie had her hands on Atlas's chest now, performing compressions while her team administered medications Bobby couldn't identify. The heart monitor remained flat, that awful sustained tone echoing through the observation room like a funeral dirge. Bobby closed his eyes, remembering the first day he'd found Atlas as a puppy behind the shelter in Saigon. The tiny German Shepherd had been hiding in a cardboard box, frightened and alone, his mother killed by the same mortar rounds that had claimed Marcus Thompson. Bobby had picked up the trembling puppy, looked into those brown eyes, and felt something shift in his war-torn soul. "He's going to make it," Marcus Webb said quietly, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. "My father wouldn't have led you to him just to take him away." The flat tone of the heart monitor continued for what felt like eternity. Bobby found himself praying, not the desperate bargaining he'd done during his worst PTSD episodes, but something deeper and more honest. He prayed for the strength to accept whatever outcome awaited them, for the grace to have been Atlas's companion for as long as he had, for the wisdom to know that some love transcends even death. Then suddenly the monitor chirped. Once, twice. A weak but steady rhythm began to emerge from the speakers. "Doctor." Yazzie stepped back from the table, her surgical mask pulled down to reveal a face glistening with sweat. She looked up at the observation window and gave Bobby a weary thumbs up. "He's back," Dr. Hernandez breathed beside Bobby. "His heart is beating on its own, and the new kidney is showing signs of function." Bobby's knees nearly buckled with relief. Marcus Webb caught his arm, steadying him as they both watched Atlas's chest rise and fall with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. The German Shepherd was alive, but the surgery was far from over. Dr. Yazzie worked for another 3 hours, carefully closing the surgical sites on both dogs and monitoring their vital signs. Scout, the donor dog, had weathered the surgery beautifully and was already showing signs of waking from anesthesia. Atlas remained unconscious, his body focused on the massive task of accepting the foreign organ that might save his life. When Dr. Yazzie finally emerged from the surgical suite, she looked like she'd aged 10 years. Bobby and Marcus stood as she approached, reading her expression for any sign of hope or despair. "The surgery was successful," she said without preamble. "Both dogs are stable. The transplanted kidney is functioning, though it will take several days to know if Atlas's body will fully accept it." Bobby felt tears he hadn't realized he'd been holding back stream down his cheeks. "Can I see him?" "He'll be unconscious for several more hours, but yes, he's being moved to intensive care now." The ICU was a quiet room filled with monitors and the soft sounds of machines keeping vigil over recovering animals. Atlas lay on a padded table, still intubated but breathing steadily. His fur had been shaved around the surgical site, and multiple IV lines ran into his legs, but his heart beat strongly on the monitors. Bobby approached slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter this fragile miracle. He placed his hand gently on Atlas's head, feeling the warmth of living fur beneath his palm. "You did it, boy," Bobby whispered. "You fought your way back." Marcus Webb stood at a respectful distance, watching the reunion between man and dog. In his hand, he clutched the photograph of his father, the young soldier who had died believing that Bobby Mitchell would take care of his legacy. "Dr. Hernandez," Marcus called softly. "The donor dog, Scout. What will happen to him?" "He's recovering beautifully. His previous owners surrendered him to the shelter, so technically he's available for adoption once he's fully healed." Bobby looked up from Atlas, understanding immediately where Marcus's thoughts were heading. "You're thinking about adopting him?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I've lived alone since my mother died. Maybe it's time I learned something about the kind of loyalty my father valued." He paused. "Besides, Scout and Atlas will always be connected now. They're brothers in a way." The symmetry felt right. 2 dogs who had saved each other. 2 men learning to heal from the wounds left by war and loss. Bobby imagined Marcus Thompson smiling somewhere, seeing his son finally understand the lessons he'd tried to leave behind. Hours passed in the quiet vigil of the ICU. Bobby dozed in a chair beside Atlas's table while Marcus made phone calls to his supervisor, to Scout's veterinary team, to the adoption coordinator at the shelter. The practical details of their new reality were falling into place with surprising ease, as if the universe had been waiting for them to stop fighting and start healing. As evening approached, Atlas began to show signs of waking. His ears twitched at familiar sounds, his breathing changed rhythm, and finally, those brown eyes opened and focused on Bobby's face. "Hey there, warrior," Bobby said softly. "Welcome back." Atlas couldn't wag his tail yet, too many tubes and too much weakness, but something in his eyes conveyed the same unconditional love that had sustained Bobby through 8 years of struggle. The kidney transplant had been successful, but more than that, a promise made by a dying soldier 40 years ago had finally been kept. Dr. Yazzie stopped by for evening rounds, checking Atlas's vital signs and nodding approvingly at the numbers on his monitors. "The new kidney is functioning well," she reported. "If he continues to improve at this rate, he'll be able to go home in a week." Home. Bobby thought of the rusted bus in the desert, of the life they'd rebuilt from scraps and determination. It would need some modifications now. Atlas would require careful monitoring and medication schedules, but it was still home. And now, with Marcus Thompson's insurance money and the VA benefits that should have been approved months ago, Bobby could make that home everything it was meant to be. Not just a shelter from the world, but a sanctuary for healing, a place where old soldiers and loyal dogs could find peace together. 3 months later, Bobby stood in the shade of his transformed bus, watching Atlas chase a tennis ball across the desert floor with the boundless energy of a dog half his age. The new kidney had been a complete success. Atlas's blood work was perfect, his appetite had returned with a vengeance, and his coat gleamed silver and black in the Arizona sunshine. The bus itself had undergone its own transformation. What had once been a rusted shell was now a gleaming mobile home, painted forest green with cream trim that reflected the heat instead of absorbing it. Solar panels covered the roof, feeding a battery system that powered everything from air conditioning to a small refrigerator stocked with Atlas's medications. The interior featured custom cabinetry built from reclaimed wood, efficient appliances, and a comfortable sleeping area that Bobby and Atlas shared. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the outside. Bobby had used part of Marcus Thompson's insurance money to establish the Thompson-Mitchell Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing emergency veterinary care for service animals belonging to veterans. The foundation operated out of a small office in Phoenix, with Marcus Webb, Jr. as its executive director and Dr. Hernandez as the chief veterinary consultant. Marcus had indeed lost his job at the VA, but the investigation that followed had resulted in sweeping changes to the benefits approval process. Dozens of veterans who had been unfairly denied claims received retroactive payments, and new oversight procedures were put in place to prevent future abuses. Marcus faced no criminal charges. His supervisors recognized that his actions, while wrong, had stemmed from personal trauma rather than malicious intent. The transformation in Marcus Webb, Jr. had been as dramatic as Atlas's recovery. The bitter, angry man who had systematically denied veterans' claims had evolved into a passionate advocate for military families. He'd adopted Scout, the German Shepherd mix, who had donated the kidney that saved Atlas, and the two dogs had become inseparable companions during their frequent visits to Bobby's desert home. On this particular afternoon, both dogs were engaged in an elaborate game of keep away with the tennis ball, their playful barks echoing across the landscape. Bobby smiled as he watched them, marveling at how different his life had become since that desperate morning when he'd almost given up hope. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the desert silence. Bobby recognized the engine of Sarah's SUV, but there was a second car following, Tommy's rental sedan from the Phoenix airport. Both of his children had been planning to visit, but seeing them arrive together was unexpected. Sarah climbed out of her vehicle first, her nursing scrubs replaced by casual jeans and a t-shirt. She'd been a regular visitor since Atlas's surgery, often bringing Bobby's grandchildren to play with the dogs and explore the desert. Tommy emerged from his rental car more cautiously, his corporate lawyer instincts still making him approach his father's unconventional lifestyle with some wariness. "Dad," Sarah called out, walking over to embrace Bobby warmly. "Atlas looks incredible. I can't believe how much energy he has." Tommy approached more slowly, taking in the transformed bus with obvious surprise. Wow. Dad, this is amazing. It looks like something out of a magazine." Bobby felt a familiar surge of pride at his son's approval. The bus represented more than just a home. It was proof that broken things could be made beautiful again, that starting over didn't mean starting with less. Atlas bounded over to greet the visitors, his tail wagging furiously as he demanded attention from both Bobby's children. Sarah laughed and knelt down to scratch behind his ears, while Tommy hesitantly offered his hand for the dog to sniff. "I brought someone I wanted you both to meet," Tommy said, gesturing toward his rental car. A woman Bobby didn't recognize was climbing out of the passenger seat, followed by two young children. "Dad, Sarah, this is Jennifer," Tommy continued, his voice carrying a nervous excitement Bobby hadn't heard in years. We're engaged." Jennifer was a small woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair that she wore in a simple ponytail. The children, a boy and girl who looked to be around 8 and 6, hung back shyly behind their mother. "Jennifer's a widow," Tommy explained. "These are her kids, Michael and Emma." "I've been meaning to bring them to meet you, but I wasn't sure." He didn't finish the sentence, but Bobby understood. Tommy hadn't been sure if his father's desert lifestyle would be appropriate for young children, hadn't known if the man living in a converted bus would be the kind of grandfather he wanted his stepchildren to know. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mr. Mitchell," Jennifer said warmly, stepping forward to shake Bobby's hand. "Tommy's told me so much about you and Atlas." The children were staring at the dogs with fascination. Atlas seemed to sense their interest and approached slowly, his natural gentleness on full display. Scout followed his lead, both German shepherds allowing themselves to be petted by small, curious hands. "Are these the dogs that saved each other?" Emma asked, her voice filled with wonder. "They sure are," Bobby replied, kneeling down to her level. "Atlas got a kidney from Scout, and Scout got a loving home from Scout's new dad, Marcus. Sometimes helping someone else is the best way to help yourself." Sarah watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. "Dad, there's something else we wanted to talk to you about. Tommy and I have been discussing it, and we think it's time you knew how proud we are of what you've accomplished here." Tommy nodded, his own emotional walls finally cracking. "We were wrong, Dad. We thought you were running away from your problems, but you were actually facing them head-on. You just did it in your own way." Bobby felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came with unexpected emotional moments. "I had good teachers," he said quietly. "Atlas taught me about loyalty. Marcus Thompson taught me about sacrifice. Even Marcus Webb taught me about forgiveness." "Speaking of Marcus," Sarah said, "he called me last week. The foundation has received its first major donation, $100,000 from a veterans organization in California. They want to expand the program nationwide." The Thompson-Mitchell Foundation had already helped 17 veterans with emergency veterinary care for their service animals. Each success story felt like a small victory over the bureaucratic indifference that had nearly cost Bobby his most faithful companion. As the afternoon wore on, Bobby gave his family a complete tour of the bus and the surrounding area. Jennifer and the children were fascinated by the solar power system, the rainwater collection setup, and the garden where Bobby grew vegetables in the harsh desert environment. Tommy asked detailed questions about the construction techniques and the financial planning that had made the transformation possible. But it was Sarah's reaction that moved Bobby the most. His daughter, who had been so worried about his mental health and living conditions, now saw the bus as what it truly was, not a desperate retreat from the world, but a carefully crafted sanctuary that reflected his values and needs. "You've built something beautiful here, Dad," she said as they watched the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. "It's not what I expected, but it's exactly right for you." As evening approached, Marcus Webb arrived with Scout for their weekly visit. The routine had developed naturally. Marcus would drive out from Phoenix on Friday evenings, and the two men would spend the weekend working on foundation business, maintaining the bus, or simply sitting in the desert silence that had become precious to both of them. Marcus looked healthier than he had 3 months ago. The anger that had consumed him for decades had been replaced by purpose, and his work with the foundation had given him a way to honor his father's memory that felt authentic and meaningful. "Bobby," Marcus said as he climbed out of his truck, "I have news. The documentary crew wants to come out next month to film the final segment." A filmmaker from PBS had been following Bobby and Atlas's story for the past 2 months, creating a documentary about veterans, service animals, and the healing power of second chances. The film was scheduled to air on Veterans Day, with proceeds from distribution going to support the foundation's work. "The producer thinks it could win awards," Marcus continued. "More importantly, it could help us reach veterans across the country who need to know about the foundation." Bobby nodded thoughtfully. The publicity made him uncomfortable, but if it meant helping other veterans and their companions, he could endure the attention. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, Bobby's extended family gathered around a campfire behind the bus. Jennifer and the children roasted marshmallows while Tommy and Sarah shared stories about their father's transformation. Marcus sat quietly holding the photograph of his father that he now carried everywhere. Atlas and Scout lay on either side of Bobby, their warm bodies pressed against his legs. The German Shepherds had developed their own bond, but they both understood that Bobby was the center of their pack, the human who had fought for their survival when others might have given up. "Dad," Tommy said eventually, his voice carrying across the crackling fire, "I owe you an apology. When you first moved out here, I thought you'd lost your mind. I thought you were choosing a dog over your family." Bobby looked at his son, seeing Margaret's features reflected in Tommy's face. "And now? Now I understand that you weren't choosing Atlas over us," Tommy replied. "You were learning how to be the man we needed you to be. The grandfather Jennifer's kids deserve to know." The words hung in the desert air like a benediction. Bobby felt the last of his doubts about the choices he'd made dissolve into the starlit night. He'd found his way back to his family by first finding his way back to himself, and Atlas had been his guide for every step of that journey. As the fire died down and his family prepared to return to their hotels in Phoenix, Bobby reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when he'd almost ended Atlas's suffering. The foundation was helping veterans across the Southwest. Marcus Webb had found redemption through service. Bobby's children had learned to respect his choices. And 2 dogs who had saved each other were living proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources. The desert night was quiet, except for the soft sounds of Atlas and Scout settling in for sleep. Bobby looked up at the stars, thinking about Marcus Thompson and all the other soldiers who hadn't made it home, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the gift of time. Time to heal, time to rebuild, time to discover that love in all its forms was the only force strong enough to overcome the random cruelties of the world. 1 year later, Bobby stood on the stage of the Phoenix Convention Center, his weathered hands gripping the podium as he looked out at an audience of 800 veterans, their families, and supporters. The Thompson Mitchell Foundation's first annual fundraising gala had exceeded everyone's expectations, raising over $2 million in a single evening. But for Bobby, the most meaningful moment wasn't the check presentations or the standing ovations. It was seeing Atlas sitting calmly at the side of the stage, his service dog vest gleaming under the lights, his brown eyes fixed lovingly on his human. "A year ago," Bobby began, his voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion he felt, "I was a broken man living in a rusted bus with a dying dog. I thought my story was ending. I thought the best I could hope for was to say goodbye with dignity." He paused, looking down at Atlas, who tilted his head as if listening to every word. "What I learned is that sometimes our stories don't end when we think they do. Sometimes they transform into something we never could have imagined." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. In the front row sat Sarah and Tommy with their families, Marcus Webb Jr., with Scout lying quietly at his feet, and Dr. Hernandez, whose skill had made this miracle possible. Beside them sat Eleanor Rodriguez, Bobby's neighbor who had become the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, and dozens of veterans whose service animals had been helped by the organization. The Thompson Mitchell Foundation has now provided emergency veterinary care for over 300 service animals across 12 states, Bobby continued. But those numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is about connections that transcend species, loyalty that transcends time, and love that transcends even death. He gestured toward Marcus Webb, who stood and walked to the podium. The transformation in Marcus over the past year had been remarkable. The angry, bitter bureaucrat had become one of the most passionate advocates for veterans' rights in the Southwest. His work with the Foundation had given him a purpose that honored his father's memory while healing his own wounded spirit. "My father, Marcus Thompson, died in Vietnam, believing that his squad mate, Bobby Mitchell, would carry on his legacy of service," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the convention center. "It took 40 years, but that legacy has grown into something my father never could have imagined, a nationwide network of support for veterans and their companions." The evening's keynote speaker was General Patricia Williams, a retired Army officer who had become a vocal advocate for military working dogs and service animals. She spoke about the unique bond between soldiers and their animal companions, the healing power of that relationship, and the importance of supporting both when they returned from service. "What Bobby Mitchell and Atlas have shown us," General Williams said, "is that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to give up on those who love us unconditionally." As the formal program concluded, Bobby found himself surrounded by veterans and their families, each with their own story of struggle and triumph. A Marine from Iraq introduced Bobby to his German Shepherd, Rex, who had been saved by Foundation funding after being hit by a car. A Navy veteran from Afghanistan told Bobby how the Foundation's support had helped her keep her service dog during a period of homelessness. But it was the youngest person in attendance who moved Bobby the most. Emma, Tommy's 8-year-old stepdaughter, had spent the evening sitting quietly with Atlas and Scout, reading to them from a picture book about dogs. When the crowd finally thinned, she approached Bobby with the serious expression of a child who had something important to say. "Grandpa Bobby," she said. She'd started calling him that 6 months earlier, much to Tommy's delight. "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up so I can help dogs like Atlas." Bobby knelt down to her level, remembering another little girl who had once drawn pictures of her father as her hero. "That's a wonderful dream, sweetheart. Atlas and Scout would be very proud to know you want to help other animals." Emma nodded solemnly. Mom says that sometimes when we love someone very much, we find ways to keep them safe. Is that what you did for Atlas? The question, asked with the innocent wisdom of a child, struck Bobby more powerfully than all the evening speeches. Yes, he said simply. That's exactly what I did. As the convention center emptied, Bobby's family gathered around him. Sarah had tears in her eyes as she hugged her father tightly. I'm so proud of you, Dad. Not just tonight, but for everything you've built this past year. Tommy, who had driven down from Denver specifically for the gala, was beaming with pride. The Foundation's impact report says you've helped save over 300 service animals. That's 300 families who didn't have to face what you almost faced with Atlas. Marcus Webb approached with Scout at his side. The two German shepherds, Atlas and Scout, greeted each other like the old friends they'd become, their bond forged through shared experience and mutual respect. Bobby, the board wants to expand into the Midwest next year. We're talking about opening regional offices in Chicago and Denver, Dr. Hernandez joined the group, still marveling at how far they'd all come since that desperate morning when Bobby had carried a dying Atlas into her clinic. I never imagined that one surgery would lead to all this, she said. You've created something truly special, Bobby. As they prepared to leave the convention center, Bobby paused to look back at the stage where banners displayed the Foundation's mission statement. Honoring the bond between veterans and their companions through emergency care, support, and advocacy. Below it, in smaller text, was the quote that had become the organization's motto. Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find, it's what finds you when you refuse to give up. The drive back to the desert was peaceful, with Atlas sleeping contentedly in the passenger seat of Bobby's truck. The bus, now equipped with internet and cell service, served as the Foundation's emergency dispatch center, coordinating veterinary care for service animals across the country. But it was still home, the place where Bobby and Atlas had learned to heal together. As they pulled up to the bus, now surrounded by a small garden and a solar-powered workshop where Bobby crafted furniture from reclaimed materials, Atlas lifted his head and looked around with satisfaction. This was their territory, their sanctuary, their proof that broken things could become beautiful again. Inside the bus, Bobby opened his laptop to check the Foundation's emergency hotline. 3 new cases had come in during the gala. A service dog in Colorado who needed surgery after being injured in a car accident, a veteran in Florida whose companion required expensive medication, and a family in Texas whose therapy animal needed emergency treatment for poisoning. Bobby smiled as he began making the calls that would coordinate help for each case. This was his life now, using Marcus Thompson's gift and Atlas's inspiration to ensure that no veteran would have to choose between their own survival and their companion's care. As he worked, Atlas settled at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on Bobby's well-being. The German Shepherd's kidney function remained perfect. His energy levels those of a dog half his age, his devotion as unwavering as ever. Outside the bus windows, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and somewhere an owl answered with its ancient wisdom. Bobby thought about Marcus Thompson, about the letter that had changed everything, about the insurance money that had been waiting 40 years to serve its purpose. "We did it, boy," Bobby whispered to Atlas. "We kept the promise." Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor, and Bobby knew that somewhere in the desert night, the spirit of a young soldier from Ohio was finally at peace. At 64, Bobby Mitchell had lost everything that defined him: his wife, his home, his sense of purpose. Living in a rusted bus with his dying German Shepherd Atlas, he faced the kind of desperation that makes grown men question whether tomorrow is worth seeing. But sometimes when we're at our lowest point, life offers us a chance to discover what we're truly made of. Bobby's refusal to give up on Atlas led him to uncover a decades-old mystery that transformed not just his life, but the lives of countless other veterans. What started as one man's desperate fight to save his loyal companion became a nationwide foundation helping hundreds of military families. Bobby learned that healing doesn't always come from moving forward. Sometimes it comes from honoring the connections that have sustained us all along. And his story reminds us that it's never too late to rebuild, to find new purpose, and to discover that our greatest contributions might come in the second half of our lives. The bus that once symbolized defeat became a beacon of hope, proving that with love, loyalty, and determination, even the most broken dreams can be restored to something beautiful. What has your most loyal companion, whether human or animal, taught you about perseverance? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in your later years that surprised even yourself? Share your stories of second chances in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone who needs hope today.